Hey guys, welcome to the very first FAQ'n Friday. Really appreciate you being here. Hope that I'm able to give you guys some good answers to your questions and connect with you guys a little bit more as this channel grows. So I'll be doing these every Friday and I'll be answering as many questions as I can get to, really. So right now it's actually Wednesday and I'm on my lunch break, so I got about 20 minutes to do this before I got to haul ass back to work. But anyways, this was the only time I was going to be able to get it done before then, so wanted to make sure I did it and lived up to my word. So let's go. First question. I'm going to be doing this real janky style and just reading them off my monitor here. So Mr. Distort6 asks, how did Bushido code land on E standard tuning? It's a nice change of pace. Good question, and that one's about my band Bushido code. We're kind of like a thrash crossover band. And we have a couple EPs out, and we've got a full-length record coming out here soon. But anyways, we decided to go with E standard tuning, which isn't really all that common these days, but I'm the youngest guy in the band at 32, and all the other guys are a little bit older, but we all love 80s thrash and that 80s thrash sound, and the majority of bands were either E standard or E flat back in those days, and that's just how we wanted to do it, you know what I mean? We also kind of wanted to prove a point and say, like, you can still be heavy in E standard. It's the writing, it's not the tuning. Tuning can help in certain situations, but we just wanted to have a nice, tight, punchy thrash sound that was also heavy when we needed it to be, and our writing would kind of invoke that. So, excellent question from Mr. Distort6. I appreciate it, man. I know you follow me on Instagram too, so thanks for checking everything out. Mohawk Bear says, what are your favorite great sounding high gain stereo and blend rigs? That's a really good question. I've used a few over the years, and I don't test things extensively before I take them out, and sometimes that bites me in the ass. But anyways, my favorite, the first that I did for a long time, and it was basically out of necessity, was I ran a 6505 and a PV XXX in stereo, because I played in a couple bands where I was the only guitarist and I wanted to use two heads. I didn't just want to run through two cabs, so I could get two different tones going. So that's what I used, and my XXX was my main tone, and my 6505 was my, I guess, rhythm tone, for lack of a better word. I didn't really play any leads or anything, but anything I needed to single out, my XXX was the tone that stayed, and then when I kicked my other amp back in, that would be my 6505. So I feel like those two amps, even though all PV amps have a similar sound signature, especially when you compare to other brands, those two amps, I could dial them differently enough that it wasn't there. We weren't stepping on any sonic frequencies, so there was no phasing. It didn't sound like too much of the same. It was a really good stereo setup, honestly, for a long time. But now that I have access to a lot more amps and stuff, that question becomes more difficult. But I've really found lately, and I think this is going to be my live rig for Bushido code moving forward, is I really like pairing a 5153 50 watt with my 50 watt Splon Super Sport KT88, which is basically a quick rod, a Splon quick rod. So a Splon quick rod and a 5153 paired together, same cab, you get kind of the best of both worlds, because the 5153 is pretty modern. The quick rod is basically just a hot rodded, super tight, high gain JCM 800, especially the older ones. They're a little closer to the 800 circuit. So those two amps, the 5150 has the real deep lows, and it's got the bright highs, and it adds a little saturation and fullness, whereas the Splon has like the Marshall mids and that punch and the clarity. So you put those two together and they sound great. So I've been running those through the same cab, and it sounds so good. I'm so bummed we can't play shows right now because everything going on, because I want to test that out live so bad. But yeah, that would be my preferred stereo rig. Honorable mentions are a 5150 and a dual rectifier. Those two always blend great together. I mean, that was pretty much like the standard hardcore stereo rig for 10, 15 years. That's a great one, and I also love blending anything modern just in general with like a Marshall type tone. So like a JCM 2000 would go great with like a 6505. It would go great with a dual rectifier. They're just kind of opposite ends of the spectrum that end up blending well and giving you more frequencies. So yeah, take that for what it's worth. That's my experience. But next question from Six String Samurai: what purchased and what selling did you regret the most? These kind of go hand in hand, honestly, and it was literally way back when I first started really kind of getting into gear about 10 years ago. At the time, you guys are going to laugh at me for this, and I still kick myself for it all the time, but I bought a Marshall JCM 800 2203 Kerry King edition on eBay for $750, which is an absolutely ridiculous deal. Even back then, that was fairly cheap. So I got it, and at the time, literally all I had was a 6505, and my only other tube amp was a Madison Divinity, which that thing was, the biggest piece of trash in the world. But anyways, I was used to the extreme saturation of the 6505, so when I got the Kerry King, it didn't quite do it for me at the time. I was playing drop C, hardcore, like Hatebreed type stuff. So that amp, this was before I even knew about boosts, okay? So, I mean, had I have had a boost at that point, I probably could have made it work, but it just wasn't what I was looking for at the time. So I ended up taking that to my local shop, World of Music, where they had a Crank Rev 1. So I traded the Marshall and a Epiphone Les Paul Prophecy. This was pretty much right after that series came out, straight up for the Crank, which was a terrible deal. And it's funny because the guy that I traded everything into is now a good friend of mine, but he definitely took advantage of me back when I didn't know what I was doing. So, but I understand you got to make money at your job and stuff. Whatever. It is what it is. We're good now. But yeah, I got the Rev. It was, it was more high gain and it was more modern. So I was happy with it at the time, but it literally died the first practice that I used it, which was the very next day. And they took it back. They could never fix it all the way. So they ended up giving me credit back, which I then used to buy my first Gibson Les Paul, which was a Les Paul Studio, which I overpaid out the ass for too. So there's that too. So anyways, the whole turn of events was just bad. It was just bad. I got a great deal to start with, and I kind of, it ended up biting me in the ass just because I didn't know what I was doing. So later down the line, actually, I think a year ago, 2 years ago, I got another 2203 Kerry King, and I loved it. But again, man, like I got such a good deal on it, and somebody offered me a ridiculous amount of money for it. So money talks, unfortunately, sometimes had to let it go, but now I'm kind of, I miss it because it was a great amp for sure. So that was my biggest regret by far. Zombie Master 517 says, how do I make a PV sound good? Cool new addition to the channel. Thanks, Jesse. That's my buddy Jesse from hardcore band you might know called Buried Alive. Him and I chat gear all day long, and he loves Mesa and I love PV, and we bust each other's balls over it all day long. How do you make a PV sound good? I don't know, man. Play it better. Set it up better. Sounds like user error to me. Thomas Person, album tones versus live tones, both for other bands and experiences with your own amps. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking me. Yeah, I think I did. Yeah, I did ask you to elaborate on that one, man. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. He also asked solid state or tube amps. Both. I mean, I'm definitely a tube amp guy, but I've owned some really awesome solid state amps. The PV Supreme 160 was absolutely killer. I got that thing for $100, and I also had one of the XXLs, and that thing was awesome. Like that thing, both amps just completely took me by surprise. Neither of them needed a boost. They were both super tight, super gainy, punchy, and for $100 each. That was just stupid money, you know what I mean? I haven't really tried anything else. I know that Ampeg VH140C is a really popular like death metal amp. Never really got to play with one too much, so there's a Crate GX130C, I think it is, or something like that, that I think is supposed to be exactly the same as the Ampeg, but correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not super up on the solid state stuff, but I think they both have their place. I think they both work. I personally prefer tube amps, but I'm never going to be the guy that craps on everything solid state. I just think that's stupid. Both can sound great. A lot of it's in the setup, what you use it with, what you use it for. So yeah, I mean there's some great solid state amps out there. Um, Next question from Intro Bust. How do I dial my 6505 not plus to sound like Satisfaction? Or alternatively, what's a good ass tone for that 90s hardcore with a TS9 in front? Well, most bands at that time, I don't think were boosting. I think they were just using like a dual rectifier or a 6505, just scoop a lot of the mids and highs out and turn the lows up, and that was kind of your average hardcore tone back then, man. Um, Plug straight in was something usually with EMGs. That was the standard for a long time too. I don't know about in the 90s. I think in the 90s, I mean, not a lot of dudes had tube amps unless they were in bigger bands, so they were using solid state stuff. And I noticed a lot of like Ibanez guitars and stuff like that back in the old days. Maybe it was just another budget thing. I know a lot of guys use Les Pauls, but they tend to be in the bigger bands. When I see pictures of smaller bands, they were using like Ibanez's, and I have no idea what pickups were in those things. But I'm gonna guess it was something probably higher output. So yeah, I mean, just mids, presence, highs. Don't dial them off, but dial them back. Dial your low end up, and get the gain up, and it's pretty easy to sound like Satisfaction. Not the greatest guitar tone, but it is the greatest hardcore record ever written. Modern hardcore, anyways. Next question is the Fat Apache. Amp chug blends would be fun. Heads, brands, whatever. I'm always on the quest for the perfect chug in my head. Yeah, man, I like blending amps too. I think it's fun. If I have the time and I can turn the volume up, I definitely like playing together and seeing what comes out of it. I mean, if you don't have a pedal that can cut the phasing, a lot of heads will phase together, but good chug blends, we kind of talked about the stereo rigs already, but I think that I don't know, man, you PV and Marshall together, PV and Mesa together, kind of the same deal, you know what I mean? Because that's what I go for. I want a nice punchy full low end, but that's still tight and still has some articulation. And a lot of it's how you dial it in, and a lot of it is your right hand. And I know everybody says tone is in the fingers, but really, I mean, you're picking your right hand technique is huge for that. If you got a loose, floppy, sloppy right hand, and you're just kind of setting it on the strings and going like this, it's gonna sound terrible no matter what. You want that hand pushing on those strings, and you want to attack those strings basically with as much as you can get out of your hand as possible. That's how you get those really punchy, percussive low end chugs and stuff like that. So that would be more than amps. I have no idea how your right hand technique is. I'm assuming it's good, but I mean, yeah, I mean that's more than anything, because I can get a good punch out of almost any amp that I play or own. So I just worked on my right hand technique for a long time. My buddy Brendan Breakdown, thanks for the question, man. He says, I'm a big fan of virtual amps plugins from Neural DSP. However, I'd like to try recording from a real amp and a 2x12. Can you give me a few tips on what mic to use, placement? And thanks for taking our questions. For sure, man. I'm not the greatest at this stuff. I'm still very, very new when it comes to recording stuff. I've watched a lot of videos and tried a few things for myself, and really, especially if you're just doing this by yourself at home, it's hard to beat an SM57 straight on the speaker where the dust cone meets the cap. That's kind of like the standard, and put it up as close to the grow cloth as you can. That's basically like the standard home recording for metal. You know what I mean? That's kind of the first step for everybody. You can start adding mics and blending mics and stuff like that. I haven't really found anything at my, I've got a Sennheiser S421. I've got a Sennheiser E609. I've got a few SM57s. I've got a Shure SM7B, which actually sounds surprisingly good on guitars. And I've got a couple Audix Tom mics, which Spectre Sound Studios did a video where he used, I think, a D6 or a D2 or something like that in tandem with a SM57 for guitar tones, and it sounded really good. So I've messed around with some of that stuff, but I haven't really found anything that's worked for my ear. Even with the SM57, I feel like I kind of end up disappointed sometimes, but I think that's just me and my expectations. But or it could just be my mic placement, you know what I mean? It's hard to place a mic really properly when you're the only guy there and you can't play and kind of hear at the same time. until you get a really good feel for it, or just, you know, feel out a cab, and once you have that spot, you mark it down. So anyways, yeah, SM57, direct on a vintage 30, which I know you have. I know you got Mesa cabs. Right where the dust cone meets the cap. That's the kind of the balance of brightness and fullness that you're going to get best with a single mic. So give that a try. Patrick Colucci, favorite amps that you have and amps that you want. Favorite amp that I have, I'll put it down to two. And it is, number one is my Splon Pro Stock 6550. It's a first year, not that I'm into all that crap, but there's differences with the Splon. The circuit was different at the time. There was no gears. He used Mercury Magnetics transformers, which I don't know if I love or hate Mercury Magnetics transformers because I've never tried the same amp with different transformers. It's really hard to tell. But anyways, that amp, just everything, it has everything going for it. It's very saturated. The controls, which I've noticed with Splon, the presence kind of has a terrible sweep. It's like off almost all the way up until 9 or 10. It's worse than the 6505. But on that one, the EQ controls seem to have a little bit more sweep to them. That thing is tight. It is mean. It is articulate. It's got tons of gain. It's the perfect modded Marshall sound in my head. That one sounds the closest to my 2203 out of all the modded Marshall style amps that I have. It just has more gain. It's clear. It's got a huge, punchy, tight low end. It's basically everything I personally would want out of a modded Marshall for what I do. It's just a killer amp, and I own 3 Splons total. The other is a Pro Mod, and that again is a first year. I lucked out and found those within a month of each other. I have no idea how. But that's got KT88s in it, and that's a 50 watt. And it sounds a good bit different, but can be dialed in extremely similar. And then I've got my Super Sport, which is, again, I did a shootout between the 3 amps on SoundCloud, and you're very hard pressed to find the difference between the 3. It's kind of crazy. They sound very similar. So yeah, I would say that Pro Stock 6550 is my number one, and my number 2 would be the 5153 50 watt. Surprisingly, I just love that amp, man. Those are the 2 amps that I used on the new Bushido code record on my side of the tracks. They blended really well. They had a perfect mix of the modern and the old school thrash tone. You know what I mean? So it's a little bit of the New Testament stuff. The guitar tones on that are 5150, and you can tell as soon as you hear it. They sound ridiculous. I really liked them, but I wanted that Splon in there too, because that has more of the classic thrash sound with a big, tight, punchy low end, lots of articulation, and I got just what I wanted out of it. So I'm super happy with that. Those are my 2 favorite amps. I have so many, sometimes it's tough to narrow it down. The Triple X will always have a spot in my heart, and I don't turn it on and play it that much anymore, but every time I do, I'm like, man, I need to play this thing more often. It sounds so good. Amps that I want, number 1 on the list, Wizard Modern Classic 2. I want one of those really bad. I've wanted one for years. They come up at good prices when I'm not really willing to buy. So it's kind of just been a timing thing for me. Like, I get in these moods where I want to hoard a bunch of gear, as you guys have seen, and I'll go out and buy all sorts of stuff, and then I'll go and sell it all off. And when I'm selling, I don't ever want to buy stuff, even if I find a good deal on something that I'm looking for. So it's just never lined up timing wise, but that is absolutely number 1 on the list. Number 2 on the list, I need to get a Soldano SLO 100 or 30 at some point. I want to try the new ones. I do. The old ones, they interest me, but I would rather get a newer production model and try that and see how that feels. But I really would like to try one of those, and I think the 30 is the one I would want, because the 100 you have to get to ungodly high volumes to really get the goods out of it, and I don't want that. And I understand the transformers will be different in the 30, but yeah, videos I've heard, reviews I've heard, you got to always take that stuff with a grain of salt, but the 30 sounds phenomenal. Put a boost in front of that thing, man, maybe an EQ in the loop, now that the loop is in a usable place for modern effects, and I bet you that thing could be nasty, and I can't wait to try one. I'll have one at some point. Other than those 2, I've pretty much had and tried everything that I've wanted to play, to be 100% honest. There's not much left out there that I haven't been able to play. Seriatone Molecular, which is a Cameron Atomica kind of clone, but Nick always changes the circuits up a little bit. Love to try one of those. Even though I'm not a huge fan of the Fortin brand, I would love to try a Fortin Meshuggah. That would be really cool, or like a Killer Cali. Even more so, I'd like to try a Gower modded one, but I can't see myself paying those prices anytime soon. But we'll see. I mean, like I said, if a deal ever comes up just right, those are the ones that I'd want to grab. And a Diesel Hagen. I'd like to try a Hagen real bad. But those are the amps that I would want to at least have to try. Maybe not to keep, but to give them a good old college try. Richard Duke says, hi, first things first, I've been enjoying your videos since you're familiar, have an array of amps, overdrives, and work on a budget. What do you feel is the best budget? $150 or less overdrive boost, mainly for boosting a 6505 Marshall 8100 VH140 and such. In other words, a versatile budget overdrive to cover solid state and tube driven amps. Mostly death metal. It's kind of hard to go wrong with the classics. I don't pay attention to drives all that much anymore, just because I found what I wanted in the MXR M77. I tried a whole bunch when I got that and nothing knocked it off. Now recently I've added a Mesa Grid Slammer, which I really like because that one keeps some lows in more and doesn't have as much of a overall mid boost, and is very clear. And then the KHDK has actually been the Ghoul Screamer has been the number one on my board. Derek showed me one of those and it just sounded awesome. I loved all the options. It's super clear, retains a good amount of low end, is a little bit punchier than the MXR. The MXR can be a little mushy at times depending on the amp, and it's clear. I don't know if I said that already, but it's definitely like clear. It's more transparent. It's got a mid boost, but it doesn't really affect the voicing, whereas the MXR M77 has quite a bit of a mid bump and a voicing change, and there's quite a bit of clipping introduced even with the drive all the way down. So the KHDK is just a little cleaner all around. So yeah, I went off on a tangent, didn't answer your question at all. MXR M77, the badass modified overdrive, is a great one because it allows you to control your bass and your low mids with the bump switch too. Gives you some options and makes it work in front of most heads really well. Otherwise, a Boss SD1 is a great option. Used Tube Screamer is a great option. That's pretty much it for the under $150 realm. If you're like me and you buy everything used, then you've got a lot of options under 150 bucks. So that MXR should sell for like 60, 70 bucks tops on the used market. Don't pay more than that. But that would be my number one recommendation. That's based off my personal taste and my experience over the last few years. So, very last question, and I appreciate you guys checking this whole thing out and staying. I'm actually probably going to be a minute or two late to work. Whoops. PV Triple X versus the Ultra 60. Triple X, hands down for me. I really like the Ultra 60, but I feel like it's thinner and it is harder to EQ the way that I want it to sound. It's a little quackier and a little honkier in the mids than the Triple X. I feel like the Triple X kind of smoothed the mid out on the amp. Actually, maybe, at times it can be a little too much, but that's where that amp shines with like KT77s or EL34s in it. Add some of those upper mids back into it. So yeah, my choice would be the Triple X, but honestly, if you can find either for 300 bucks or less, jump on them right now because they're both absolutely killer high gain tube amps that can get you a ton of tones, get you clean to mean, and everything in between. But anyways, that's all I got time for today. Those are actually all the questions. I was able to get to all of them. If you guys have more questions, please put them in the comments of this video and I will reference them for the next FAQ'n Friday for the following week. Again, I really appreciate you guys engaging with me. This is awesome. I'm really enjoying doing the channel so far. People seem to be like the bullshooting videos where I just ramble on about gear. That's cool too. So I'm going to try and get one or two more of those out in the next week. And then I've got a whole bunch of demos that I want to get done and put up because I'm going to be selling a bunch of amps. Some of them are behind me. The Friedman BE50 is going to go. The Sheep is going to go. Probably one of my Uber Shawls are going to go. among other things. So I want to get some good demos of those amps up. So keep your eyes open. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.